Hey everybody, Ramey here. Today we're going to talk about a really serious topic, video game violence. This is a topic that's been in the media a lot lately and really a lot in the media for years and decades and just years and years and years. But it's one I really want to address and talk about. I want to talk about some statistics, really what the research says, like what kind of studies have been done on this and what do we really know about video game violence. I see people in the news and just in general spew off stuff about it on both sides of the issue. And let's talk about like what kind of studies have really been done and what does it say. So I've spent a lot of time reviewing video game violence literature, looking at all the different organizations. But let's talk about the history of this first of all. Media and violence is not new whatsoever. There were studies done. People were saying that newspapers in the 18 and 1900s could cause violence. That radio caused violence. That television caused violence. Then it was that the internet caused violence, and now we're at the games. And gaming and violence is not anything new. In 1983, the Surgeon General of the United States said that video games are a leading cause of family violence, which is, now that statement absolutely baffles my mind. Why? Because 1983, the graphics of video games, we're talking like dots on a screen. So that blows my mind away. I mean, really, that's like mind-boggling. But, and then in the 80s, we had the whole music was going to, rock and roll in the 70s and, caused violence. So there's just been a lot of different things blamed for violence. So let's look at what the research really says. Like, do video games, can they cause anything? Like, what do we really know? So the first thing, there's a few things I want to bring up. So let's talk about APA. So the American Psychological Association does consider video games a risk, considers that they can lead to a risk of aggression. This is from a 2015 study, report, that they analyzed hundreds of studies, and they found that video games can lead to a risk of aggression. Now, that doesn't mean that video games lead to criminal activity or violence or anything like that. It just means that there is a risk of aggression after playing a game. This is one risk factor of many. In their report, they say that, having a bad family life, not having friends, antisocial, all kinds. There's many, many different risk factors for aggression. And video games are one of those many risk factors. Okay, so that's from APA. That's that's their big report and their stance on video games and violence. Is that video games can lead to aggression, but they didn't say that they lead to violence. And we'll talk about why that is in a couple minutes. So in 2011, there was a big Supreme Court case about video games and violence. And this was actually Brown versus the Entertainment Merchants Association. Now, what the Supreme Court ruled is that video games are, first of all, they're covered under the First Amendment, that they can't be regulated by governments. They're a freedom of speech thing. But secondly, there was not enough evidence the Supreme Court could not find enough evidence to link video games with violence. Now, we look at APA's statement, and then I showed you kind of the opposite, which was the Supreme Court ruling. So what's going on here? So the thing that's going on here is it's almost impossible to do an actual study that looks at, do games cause violence? Why? Because I can't do something in a laboratory that allows me to really measure that. Now I can find a correlation between games and violence. I can find a correlation between games and driving a car, or games and going to sleep. There's lots of correlations, but correlations only make sense if, what you're actually looking at falls in line with that. So let's talk about video games. Let's talk about some of the statistics and correlations and things out there, because there are a number of studies on both sides of the fence here. So some of the studies, pretty much there are a lot of studies that can say video games can increase aggression, but then there are also these studies that say video games show a very small correlation to aggression. But whether or not video games cause aggression or not doesn't mean that they cause violence. And so far, no study has shown that video games actually cause violence. Now, what they have shown is that someone who has violent tendencies might be more attracted to violent media like movies or violent music or violent video games, but they're already predisposed to that. They're already a violent person. They're just attracted to that kind of media. But that doesn't mean that, like, Joe Smith or Jane Doe off the street are going to go play, Fortnite or Call of Duty for a few hours and go cause some kind of violence. Because there is no correlation. They would not do that. It doesn't change anything about them. And, okay, so let's talk about some of the statistics we do have. So, when you start to look at things like, do video games cause violence? As I said, it's so difficult to measure. So what you have to try to do is pull statistics from what's happening in society. And, games have increased so much in recent years, yet we still just don't have a lot of good statistics on them. So I'm going to pull some statistics. We know that like 60% of kids under the age of 18 play R or higher rated games like, they're playing games like Call of Duty. They're playing games like Grand Theft Auto. Games that are the most violent. We know that tons of these kids under the age of 18 are playing them. Violence like homicides were at a peak in the 90s, like early to mid 90s, for adults and for children. Since then, they have simply just decreased, like a big slope. Just going down, down, down to where they've kind of steadied out like this little, like nice little chart versus this huge increase in the early 90s. Okay, so what's happening is since they've decreased, we look at game sales and people playing games and the type of games out there. In the time from the mid 90s until now, violent video games have increased. So many more of them. More people play video games. Games are more realistic. I mean, I don't want to say game sales have like doubled since the 90s. They're like 20 times the sales of those years. Like, so to make a correlation to say that violent video games can cause these problems, yet homicide rates have went down, murders have went down, violence has went down. So why have these things went down when game sales, when so many people are playing games, violent games, and game sales have went up significantly? Can we make that correlation? Well, we're doing the same thing APA did. We're trying to base something, say something is caused by it. But it just goes to show that it's very, very difficult to pinpoint a cause of violence. So overall, we don't have any significant evidence that games do cause violence. We know that they can cause aggression, but we also know that that aggression doesn't cause someone to go out and be violent. We also know that if someone has violent tendencies, they're more interested in violent games and will go play them. Does that mean that the games caused that person to be violent? No, it seems like those people were violent before they played the game. The game just helps feed into that. So where are we on this? Do video games cause violence? I'd be hard-pressed to try to make the claim that video games cause violence. I think it's a really big stretch. Thank you.